Let's make that cue ball dance. Welcome back, everybody. In today's video, I'd like to try to give you a few tips on performing the Masse shot, where you can actually get the cue ball to curve around rather than going in a straight line. Because sometimes a kick shot or a jump shot just won't be enough to get you to that object ball. So let's get started. Okay, in typical fashion, I'm going to break down what I think are the components that make up a Masse shot. Now keep in mind, what I'm here to show you is how you would actually perform a Masse shot in an actual game and not like what you see the professional trick shot artists do. So the three components I'm going to show you are elevation of the cue, how much side spin you put on the cue ball, and how hard you hit the cue ball. And then I'm going to show you how you can actually aim when you put all three of those things together correctly. So first, let's have a look at elevation. So the elevation of your cue for a Masse shot is very similar to the elevation of your cue for a jump shot. But instead of trying to get that cue ball in the air, we're more concerned about getting enough spin on that cue ball so we can actually get it to curve in the direction that we want. So what I'm hoping to demonstrate here with this 11 ball is the effects elevation can actually have. I'm going to hit the 11 ball 3 different times, hopefully with the same amount of power, but with different amounts of elevation. And what I'm expecting to see is the higher I elevate on this 11 ball, the less distance it's actually going to travel because the amount of backspin that I'm actually going to put on the 11 ball. So this first hit here is going to be at about 45 degrees, and hopefully you're actually going to see the effects as you would a drag shot, where you can actually see the 11 ball spin backwards, slide, and then roll forward. Now for this hit, we're going to elevate a little bit higher than 45 degrees. We're going to try to get somewhere between 60 and 65 degrees, and hopefully this time the 11 ball will stay in the frame of the camera. Well, not exactly, but I can tell you that it didn't roll as far as the first shot. And for this last hit, let's get the elevation of our cue on up to about 85 to 90 degrees, and I know for a fact the 11 ball will stay in the frame of the camera. So that should show you the effects elevation can have on the cue ball. Now let's combine a little side spin with it. So now that you know the effects elevation can have on the cue ball with no side spin, here's 4 different hits at the same elevation, which is going to be around 60 to 65 degrees, and again, hopefully with the same amount of power, but using different amounts of side spin. And this first hit here is going to be 1 tip of right spin. And at that elevation, with that amount of power, we get a curved path that's about 1 diamond off to the right. Now here's 2 tips of right spin. And since 1 tip of right spin curved the cue ball off to the right by 1 diamond, I'm expecting 2 tips of right spin to curve the cue ball near that corner pocket. Pretty close. Now let's hit the cue ball with left spin. And since I don't expect there to be that much of a difference from when I was using right spin, when I use 1 tip of left spin, I'm expecting the cue ball to curve to the left by 1 diamond. And then when I use 2 tips of left spin, I'm expecting the cue ball to curve near that corner pocket. Pretty close, just like before. So now you know the effects side spin can have on the cue ball when you're performing a Masse shot as well. And the closer you get to the edge of the cue ball, the more of a curve effect the cue ball will actually have. Now, let's see what power can actually do to a Masse shot. So up until now, with regards to the form, you've seen how it pretty much mimics a jump shot. I'm using an open hand V bridge. My body faces away from the direction that I'm going to shoot. I'm elevated on the cue ball, and I'm using an overhand grip just as long as the elevation of my cue is below about 70 degrees. Because once I start to go above 70 degrees, my form can actually change a little bit. Meaning that my open hand V bridge can turn into a closed hand air bridge, and my overhand grip can turn into a dart style grip. It all really depends on where the cue ball actually lies on the table. Because right now, with the cue ball being so close to a rail, I can actually hike up my left leg so that I don't have to use a closed hand air bridge, because I can rest my bridge on top of my leg and then comfortably use the overhand grip like this. Which is pretty much how I'm going to demonstrate these next three shots to it demonstrates the effects of power. I'm first going to hit soft, then medium, and then hard. And I can already tell you that the effects power will have on the cue ball for a Masse shot are very similar to how topspin and bottom spin work with respects to the tangent line. Meaning that the softer I hit the cue ball, the sooner the spin will take effect. And the harder I hit the cue ball, then the cue ball will actually travel a bit before the spin takes effect. So with this first hit here being soft, I expect the Masse to take effect pretty much right after I hit the cue ball. And now here's a medium hit. And if you saw from the soft hit, since I was hitting the cue ball so far on the right side, the cue ball went off to the left before the Masse took effect. Now with a medium hit, I expect the cue ball to go a little bit farther before the Masse takes effect. And now with the hard hit, let's see that cue ball go a little farther again before the Masse takes effect. And that'll do it for the effects of power. And now that we've seen the effects all three components can have on a Masse shot, let's put them all together and actually try them on some real shots. So the first shot I want to demonstrate is probably the most common one that you'll actually do in a game, where the curve of the Masse is relatively small. And you can actually do this inside your local pool halls because it's not as risky than when you have to do a tight Masse and your cue is pointing straight down into the table. So have a look at this setup. It's for a game of 8-ball, and we're currently on the 8, and as you can see, there's no real good way for me to get there. I can't shoot straight at it because the 2 and the 1 ball are in the way, and it's not really safe for me to try to jump over both of them, make the 8, and keep the cue ball on the table. And I also have no path to where I can kick the cue ball into the 8. So what I'm going to try to do is Masse the cue ball around the left side of the 2 ball, go in between the 1 and the 4, and pocket the 8. Now the first thing I can establish is, since I'm going to be shooting to the left side of the 2 ball, I'm going to need some amount of right spin on the cue ball to get it to curve back to the right. Now where exactly to the left of the 2 ball am I going to aim? Well, there is a system that helps determine that, and it helps determine the path the cue ball will take on the way to the 8 ball. And it goes something like this. Imagine a line that you want the cue ball to take on the way to the 8 ball. Now, from the cue ball, you could pretty much aim anywhere you want to that line as long as you're not going to hit the opposing ball. Now, from the top center of the cue ball to the felt of the table, find another point to the right of the center through the cue ball to the felt of the table again, to where when you connect those 2 points, it'll create a line that's actually parallel to the path that you want the cue ball to take. Now, with your cue, you're going to aim through the cue ball, but to the point that you found on the table through the cue ball. Now, what the system doesn't help you determine is how much elevation you need, how much side spin you need on the cue ball, and how hard to hit the cue ball, which is why I demonstrated all 3 of those components separately so you can see how they affect the masse. Now, for a typical shot like this, the most common variables are going to be about 40 to 45 degrees in elevation, 2 tips of right spin, and about a soft to medium hit to get an effect like this. And that system dates all the way back to the 1800s when a gentleman by the name of Gaspard-Coriolis came up with an effect that got named after him, the Coriolis Effect. Now for this shot, we're going to tightly masse around the 1 ball and try to make the 8. And hopefully with this aerial view, you'll have a better understanding of the system that I demonstrated from the previous shot. So again, start by imagining a line that you want the cue ball to take on its way to the 8 ball. And then aim the cue ball anywhere towards that line as long as you know that it's not going to hit the 1 ball. Now, from the top center of the cue ball, find a spot to the right of that center that goes through the cue ball down to the table to where when you connect those 2 points together, it creates a parallel line to the intended path that you want the cue ball to take. And then remember, that system there does not tell you how high you need to elevate your cue, how much spin you need on the cue ball, and how hard to hit the cue ball. But for a tight masse shot like this, I am going to elevate my cue to about 80 to 85 degrees. I'm still going to use about 2 tips of right spin, and then with regards to power, you have to remember that if I hit this cue ball softly, then the masse will take effect right after I hit the cue ball, which might cause me to hit the 1 ball. If I hit the cue ball too hard, then the cue ball might cross the intended path before it starts to turn, and I'll miss the 8 ball on its left side. But if I hit that cue ball just right, I should be able to make the 8 ball like this. And knowing how to correctly use all 3 of those components, that's just going to take a whole lot of practice. And that's going to do it for today's lesson. Now I hope with what I was able to demonstrate, you now have a better understanding of the mechanics and physics that go into a masse shot. I didn't bother mentioning the hardness of a tip needed to perform a good masse, because unless you own a masse cue, you're pretty much going to use whatever's on your playing cue. But do know that if you have a softer tip, it will perform better because it's able to grip the cue ball better. But also know that because it's a softer tip, it's going to mushroom a lot quicker because of the abuse it takes when performing a masse. And also keep in mind that tight masse shot that I demonstrated at the end, that is an absolute last resort you should take if you're not able to kick at a ball, jump at the ball, or perform some sort of small curve around an imposing ball. Because it's very difficult to execute even if you have a good understanding of the Coriolis effect and use those 3 components together correctly. But just like with anything else, with enough practice, you'll have another weapon in your arsenal to be able to get you out of those tight spots. So I hope everybody was able to enjoy and learn something from this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Take care, everybody.